El Inca by Wara. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to the deepening political crisis in Bolivia. On Sunday, Bolivian President Evo Morales resigned in what he described as a coup shortly after the Bolivian military took to the airwaves to call for his departure. On Tuesday, Morales flew to Mexico, where he has received asylum. On Tuesday night, right-wing Senator Jeanine Áñez declared herself Bolivia's new president, despite a lack of a quorum in the Congress to approve her ascension to that post.
Aquí se está frente a una sucesión presidencial.
We are facing here a presidential succession originating from the vacancy of the presidency of the state. Due to the definitive absence of the president and vice president, which means that according to the text and meaning of the Constitution, as president of the Chamber of Senators, I immediately assume the presidency of the state as foreseen in the constitutional order, and I commit myself to accept responsibility for all necessary measures to pacify the country.
Jeanine Áñez held a Bible when announcing her claim to the presidency, declaring the Bible returns to the presidential palace. Evo Morales' movement towards socialism party is refusing to recognize the new president, calling her claim illegal and decrying Morales' resignation as a military coup.
Last month, President Morales was re-elected for a fourth term in a race his opponent's claim was marred by fraud. He ran for a fourth term after contesting a referendum upholding term limits. Morales stepped down soon after accepting the Organization of American States' call for new elections. On Tuesday, Morales spoke in Mexico.
I also want to tell you, brothers and sisters, as long as I am alive, we will stay in politics. As long as I am alive, the fight will continue, and we're sure that the people of the world have all the rights to free themselves.
Morales' departure has sparked demonstrations and clashes across Bolivia. In La Paz Tuesday, his supporters took to the streets.
Remember, the opposition will never be able to govern as Evo Morales has done. It hurts us. Evo Morales was our leader. Viva Evo. We miss and love you, Evo. We have been left orphaned.
Well, for more, we host a debate on the political crisis in Bolivia. In La Paz, we're joined via Democracy Now! Video stream by Pablo Solon, former ambassador to the United Nations under President Evo Morales until 2011. He's former chief negotiator on climate change for Bolivia. And in Amherst, Massachusetts, we're joined by Kevin Young, assistant professor of history at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He's the author of Blood of the Earth, Resource, Nationalism, Revolution, and Empire in Bolivia. Young is also the editor of Making the Revolution, Histories of the Latin American Left. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin in Bolivia with Pablo Solon. Do you describe what happened as a coup?
I think it's very complicated to say it's a coup, because I think there was a popular rebellion, because this issue started in 2016 when Evo Morales didn't recognize the result of a referendum that said that he couldn't run for a new re-election. If he would have respected that referendum, he would have finished his third term as probably the best president in Bolivia. But he didn't do that. He forced that the Constitutional Tribunal did a statement saying that it was a human right to run for new elections. And then we have the elections of the 20th of October, where there was definitely fraud. We have so many evidences here, so many reports from different institutions, not only OAS saying it, that of course the population went to the streets. It was massive, and it has lasted for 20 days. So to say this is a coup d'etat planned by the White House, the right-wing forces, fascist forces, I think it's to make a caricature of what is really happening. Now, who's going to take advantage of this situation are going to be right-wing forces, is going to be the imperialism of North America. But who created this crisis, I think, was this addiction to power that Evo Morales and his party began to have during the last years.
I'd like to ask Kevin Young to deal with the same issue of whether this was a coup or not, and also to deal with the reality that the majority in the Congress is still of the is the political party of Evo Morales. So, to what degree can whoever becomes president be able to move forward with the political agenda, given the enormous strength still of the Evo Morales forces in the country?
A coup has a simple and straightforward definition. It's the unconstitutional removal of a sitting president before that president's term in office is up. And in the case of Bolivia, Evo Morales is the elected president. His term isn't due up until January 21st of 2020. And in this case, on Sunday, you have the lead commander of the Bolivian armed forces directly intervening in ordering Evo out of office. So that's a coup, and I think that's pretty straightforward. That shouldn't be controversial. What makes this coup particularly dangerous is that it is being supported by the most racist and reactionary elements in Bolivian society. Now, as well as by the United States. Now, all of that being said, the overall political situation in Bolivia is complex. All of the opposition is not the same. The opposition is not monolithic. There are opposition protesters who are much more progressive. Many indigenous groups, working-class Bolivians, have become very disillusioned with Evo's government and have turned against it. So those voices are important to recognize. We shouldn't be painting the entire opposition with the same brush or insinuating that it's all some conspiracy by the United States. But at the same time, it is important to recognize as well that almost half of the Bolivian population voted for Evo Morales on October 20th. And whether you think that's 47%, as the government said, or maybe it's only 46 or 45%, the fact remains that almost half of Bolivians still supported Evo on October 20th. And those voices also need to be counted and recognized. They may have criticisms of the government. Many of them do, and I know some of them. But they're not supporting the coup because they fear that a right-wing government is really going to roll back some of the progressive gains that have been made in the last 13 years. And in an immediate sense, they're fearful of right-wing violence in the streets, which is happening and which is targeting particularly indigenous Bolivians. Now, what's going to happen with the Congress? Because despite the fact that many MAS legislators and officials have resigned, sometimes under threat of violence from the right, it is still true that a majority of the Congress is controlled by the MAS party. They have signaled, they have said that they are interested in finding a constitutional resolution to the crisis. Now, what exactly that's going to look like is still very unclear. It's not clear what new elections are going to look like or under what conditions they're going to be held. The MAS party is somewhat in disarray the last several days, so we really don't know what's going to happen at this point.
Well, Pablo Solon, I wanted to ask you about this this issue of Evo Morales had agreed as a result of the protests in the streets and the recommendation of the Organization of American States to hold new elections. So shouldn't the opposition have at least waited until his term was up, or until new elections were held before attempting to remove him completely? And also the issue of the military. The military on the one hand, said they were not going to intercede when the police officers began rebelling against the government, but then has interceded to join the police in now attempting to quell protests of Morales supporters.
Okay, so the first thing, Evo Morales called to new elections. Well, he said he was going to call to new elections, and he said he was going to change the electoral court, which meant that he agreed that the electoral court was involved in some case of fraud in the elections of the 20th of October. Because, Evo Morales didn't say, I called with elections and I respect this electoral court. No, I will change it, because the evidence were too big. There was fraud. And of course, you had in the population, not the right-wing forces, the population said, watch out. You're saying that new elections with a new electoral court means that there was fraud. And fraud, it's something that you cannot accept. It's a crime. So you cannot say, okay, well, you know, there was fraud. Now I'm going to call for a new elections. Nothing happened in Bolivia. Now I guarantee you that everything is going to be okay. It's impossible. And what happened then? Did the military do a coup and went out to the streets that day and forced Evo Morales? No, they said, we're not going to go out to the streets. The situation is terrible. People don't accept new elections after you are recognizing that there was fraud. That is what they said. And we suggest that you resign. And they didn't went out to the streets. And Evo Morales, why did he resign? My point of view is he resigned because he was not able to sustain this idea that the elections of the 20th of October were clean. And if they weren't clean, he was involved. Because you cannot do that fraud without the involvement of the government. So he resigned and he went to El Chapare because he thought that his resignation was going to create an uprising. Because it's true what the other person says. He has the support of more than 40% of the population. And he was expecting that there would be an uprising and then his sector would mobilize. But then what happened? There was that mobilization, but that mobilization was a mix of supporters of MAS, but also of vandalic groups that began to assault, burn. There were more than 70 buses of the public service system here in La Paz that would burn, drugstores. And it was the night of Sunday and Monday was terror in many cities. And the police stations began to be attacked by this combination of mass of supporters of the political party of the government, what's called MAS, and these vandalic groups. So the police was not able to stop this. Neighborhoods began to organize to defend it themselves, not only in rich areas, but also in poor areas. At that moment, the police said, we need to have the support of the military to stop this violence, these vandalic groups. And you had the military coming out. I'm not in favor of that, but those are the facts. And then you had the military coming to the streets, and you have seen they have intervened and in places where there are vandalic groups, huge violence. But for example, yesterday, you had a big mass demonstration from El Alto.
Can we bring in Kevin Young, your response to the description of Pablo Solon of what's been going on?
Sure. So I do want to briefly address the question of the October 20th elections. There is this widespread narrative that's been uncritically embraced in the media in the United States that there was a fraud in the October 20th elections. And that's largely based on the preliminary audit of the Organization of American States, which was released this past weekend, which does contain allegations of widespread irregularities. On the other hand, we have the authoritative report from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which last week released a detailed study of the October 20th election and found that there was no evidence of fraud, or at least if there were irregularities, there was no evidence that they were decisive in determining the outcome. Now, is it possible that there were irregularities? Absolutely. I'm not denying that. But as you said, Juan, on November 10th, earlier in the day, Evo Morales actually offered to hold new elections as a major concession to the protesters. He even offered to replace the entire electoral monitoring body. And I don't see that I disagree with Pablo here. I don't see that as necessarily an admission of fraud. I see it more as a concession that was intended to keep the peace. But the fact is that the opposition, most of them didn't want new elections because they doubted that they could beat Evo at the ballot boxes. They wanted a coup, and that's exactly when the military steps in and orders Evo to leave. Now, I agree with Pablo that the situation on the streets is extremely concerning. There's violence being committed not only by the right, but also by many Mas supporters who are justly terrified of what's going to happen. So the situation is complex. It shouldn't be reduced to simple good versus bad or left versus right. But that doesn't change the fact that this was a coup. It's a complex situation, and it's a coup with some popular support, but it's still a coup.
Pablo Solon, are you concerned about, the woman who's just declared herself president, saying she's bringing the Bible back into government? Opposition protesters kidnapping Mayor Patricia Arce, the mayor loyal to Morales, forcibly cutting her hair, dousing her with red paint, parading her through the streets. And then you have, for example, the Luis Fernando Camacho, who is the far-right multimillionaire who arose, many say, out of fascist movements in Bolivia, saying Pachamama will never return to the palace. Bolivia belongs to Christ.
Well, first, let me answer. You're not right. Before the OAS, we had here in Bolivia reports. We were able to see different reports from the voting places where they changed signatures, they changed figures, numbers. OAS didn't create this because of them. They had to see the evidence that we have here. And you have other reports before the OAS report. The second thing,
Pablo, we have 30 seconds.
Excuse me. I mean, because if you say it is a coup means the military went out to the streets. Why did Evo Morales, when Evo Morales resigned, said this is a coup from the police and the civil? He didn't want to mention the military. Now, going to your question.
We're going to have to go to that question in part two of this discussion. I want to thank Pablo Solon, former ambassador to the UN under President Evo Morales until 2011, and Kevin Young, professor at University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Bolivia, right-wing Senator Jeanine Áñez declared herself president Tuesday night, despite a lack of quorum in Congress. The same day, longtime Bolivian President Evo Morales landed in Mexico, where he received political asylum. This is Jeanine Áñez.
As President of the Chamber of Senators, I immediately assume the presidency of the state as foreseen in the constitutional order, and I commit myself to accept responsibility for all necessary measures to pacify the country.
Jeanine Áñez held a Bible when announcing her claim to the presidency, declaring the Bible returns to the presidential palace. Evo Morales' movement towards Socialism Party is refusing to recognize Áñez as president, calling her claim illegal and decrying Morales' resignation over the weekend as a military coup. We continue with part two of our discussion about the political crisis in Bolivia. In La Paz, Bolivia, we're joined via Democracy Now! Video stream by Pablo Solon. He's the former ambassador to the United Nations under President Evo Morales until their split in 2011. He's the former chief negotiator on climate change for Bolivia. And in Amherst, Massachusetts, we're joined by Kevin Young, assistant professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's the author of Blood of the Earth, Resource, Nationalism, Revolution, and Empire in Bolivia, also the editor of Making the Revolution, Histories of the Latin American Left. Pablo Solon, in part one, we talked about whether this is a coup, something you don't quite believe at this point. But are you concerned about the woman who has now declared herself president, sworn in, saying, I'm bringing the Bible back, and Camacho, who comes out of this fascist movement in Bolivia?
Well, of course I'm concerned. They are right-wing groups. Our state cannot be under only one religion. But also, you have to mention the other side. This new president has said that she will respect the Huipala, the flag of indigenous people, and the flag of indigenous people has came back to the main square of the government. If you ask me, do I believe that what we are going to see is more and more racist attitudes from the government against indigenous people? I believe that the government and the entire society wants peace. And what we will see, what we hear more and more is, okay, we will respect all the symbols and we want to have peace. So now the main question is to Evo Morales. Because Evo Morales, the situation in Bolivia is that he has 2/3 in the parliament. So if he doesn't want to go forward to a new election, then the whole situation is going to be very complicated. So you have to go to an agreement. You have to come to an agreement between the forces of Evo Morales and the opposition in order to have those new elections in the next 2-3 months or even less. But what happens if Evo Morales keeps blocking any kind of agreed solution? We will have more conflict.
Kevin Young, your response.
And more people dead, killed.
Sure. So I'm actually in agreement with Pablo's argument that Evo Morales does bear some share of the responsibility here, but that doesn't erase the fact that this is still a coup. When the military intervenes and orders the elected president out before the end of his term in office, that's a coup. So whatever one thinks of Evo and the MAS, even if we have strong criticisms of their policies, even if we have strong criticisms of Evo's insistence on running for a 4th term, the solution is not a right-wing coup. And that's exactly why many progressive Bolivians are so concerned about what's happening. Take, for example, one of the leading feminist organizers in the country, Adriana Guzman. She has often been a very critical voice, critical of the MAS and some of its policies. But she's come out since the coup in no uncertain terms, denouncing what has happened and warning very strongly that this really could end up empowering the right wing, and people like her, indigenous women, are going to be some of the primary victims of that. And when she says that, she may well have in mind some examples from Bolivia's own history when the left, or parts of the left, joined forces with the right wing to depose sitting governments, thinking that it would bring about a better result, and it ended up unwittingly empowering the right wing. So I'll give one or two quick examples. In 1946, there was a government in power at the time. The U.S. didn't like it. The U.S. supported a coup. The right wing in Bolivia supported it. And significant portions of the left supported that coup as well, thinking that it was going to lead to a better result. And they did, like today, they did have some legitimate grievances with the government. But the result was disastrous. It was 6 years of very repressive governments. The same thing happened in 1964. Part of the left left joined the right in deposing the elected government of Victor Paz Astensoro, and the result was 18 years of military rule. The left at that moment in 1964 actually thought that they would be allowed to share some of the power. They were very quickly disabused of that notion. The military closed the doors to them and said, no, we'll take it from here, guys. So we do need to be careful about the unintended consequences of our political positions here, and that's precisely what people like Adriana Guzman and many other indigenous and working-class Bolivians are warning us about right now.
Pablo Solon, I wanted to ask you about what's happening right now in Washington, where you have the OAS holding an emergency meeting. The U.S. ambassador to the OAS, Carlos Trujillo, read a statement from President Trump applauding Morales' resignation, warning it should, quote, send a strong signal to Venezuela and Nicaragua. Pablo Solon.
Well, as I said before, this situation is going to be used, they are going to take advantage of it. It's clearly. The risk that you will have more right-wing forces, a change of balance of forces, it's absolutely true. But the main thing that we have to learn as activists that come from the left is, why did this happen? This would have not happened if we wouldn't have forced a new re-election and go to a situation where there is fraud. That is why we are in this situation. It's tragic. I'm not saying that I have a lot of hope on what is going to happen. There's going to be a lot of conflict and probably violence here, and people are going to be killed. We have already 7 people that have been killed during the 20 days of protests, some of the opposition, but also some on the other side, and this is terrible. So what do we do? The question is, do we say, oh, because there is the risk that the right-wing forces can come, we have to sustain Evo Morales, even we know that what he's doing is absolutely wrong, and it went against the Constitution, because the Constitution says you can only be reelected once. So that is the concrete issue. Is Evo Morales can come back to Bolivia? I don't think so. Not at all. After what he did, it's impossible. At least in the next months, years. A different situation would have been if a government that comes from an indigenous people and the left says, okay, I finished my term, now I'll go to my house, and in 5 years I will come back, of course. And even the political party of MAS could have won the elections without Evo Morales.
Kevin Young, your response.
Well, again, I do partially agree with what Pablo is saying. One of the legitimate, I think, critiques of the MAS over the years has been that it has been too centered on Evo as a leader. They haven't sufficiently opened the door to new leadership from the grassroots level. So that is, I think, a fair critique of Evo Morales. But the fact remains that the situation facing people on the ground right now in Bolivia is extremely dangerous. And that's why so many progressive Bolivians are condemning this as a coup. And we need to listen to those voices as well.
Can I say something?
Pablo Solon.
Well, I mean, I respect the opinion of, I don't know who you quoted, but I can list you several activists that were part of the government, that were part of this process of change, more active than the person that you just mentioned, that are saying, no, this is not a coup. So you have to be more balanced in what you're saying. Well, and you have to see that there is risk, yes, but there is risk also on the other side too. Because if this situation continues, you have violence against also from these groups that come assault, burn houses. You have to see also this other side. It's not only, oh, the military, the right-wing forces are going to come and smash indigenous people. You have groups of mass, vandalic groups also coming and smashing people not only of the middle class, but also of popular sectors, some that also supported mass. So we have to see all the complexity of the situation.
Kevin Young, do you disagree on that?
So I do agree that there is a risk of violence from mass supporters as well. That much is true. But it's very important to recognize that Bolivian popular sectors, working class people, indigenous people, small farmers, feminists, are not speaking with a unified voice here. They're not monolithic. Some of them are supporting the change in government. They have been organizing large protests because they do have legitimate grievances against the MAS. But on the other hand, you have very large, probably larger portions of those same sectors who are calling it a coup and who aren't willing to support the change in government. So, it's true that there have been a number of figures who served in Evo's government who have then turned against him. It's perfectly true that there are a number of very important indigenous organizations who have turned against the MAS. But we need to be careful about elevating those voices above the voices of the 47%, nearly half of the population who voted for Evo on October 20th. So Bolivian popular forces are not monolithic. They're not speaking with one voice. So we need to be mindful of that.
Pablo Solon, are you concerned about, and you are very aware of this history, your family, your father, the great muralist, comes out of a very progressive tradition in Bolivia. You were close to Evo Morales until your split in 2011. Are you concerned about the CIA involvement in coups in Bolivia in 52 and 64 and 1970 and 1980, and what the U.S. will do with what's happening today?
Yes, of course. I must tell you that my brother was enforced disappeared by the dictatorship of Banzer in the year 1972. I am totally against the military. So I am very concerned. And I fully agree that if we want to find a solution, we must take into account those people that support mass. They are a very important part of the population, almost half. We have to take them in account, of course. But we have to bring peace. And you cannot bring peace if you don't come to an agreement in the current situation. Or is there another way? If you say, okay, we're going to support mass and go against the other sector of the population, then you will have violence from this other side. And that violence has happened already. It's not a supposition. It's something that has happened. This burning houses of also persons from the opposition. So now, is Evo willing to come to an agreement to bring peace and say, okay, we're going to go to elections with an electoral court that is totally independent from political parties, from the government, and let's hear from that election the result? I think that from the side of the right-wing forces that are in the opposition, even from the current president, there is the willingness to have peace and have an electoral court. And they are going to put some figures that probably are very transparent. But they have to be also accepted by mass, and mass has to put some figures that are also transparent, and we have to go to the new elections. If we don't do this, of course the CIA, of course the more right-wing forces, fascist forces, are going to say, see, there is nothing to discuss anymore. We cannot discuss anymore with the people of mass. We just have to go and beat them. So this is the situation where we are. How do we stop these right-wing forces? By blocking any kind of possible new election, hoping that the majority of the people will suddenly change and 80% of the population will say, okay, Evo Morales come back and everything will be peaceful? I don't think so.
Kevin Young?
So I would go back to November 10th again. Evo did actually offer to conduct an entirely new election, did offer to replace the entire electoral monitoring tribunal. And, you know, what Pablo is describing might actually be a good scenario here. I'm not quite as optimistic as he seems to be about the willingness of the right to go forward with that, because after all, on November 10th, they did reject Evo's offer, and that's when the military commander came out and ordered Evo to leave office. Now, Amy, since you mentioned the U.S. role, I think that for those of us in the United States, we need to be especially focused on that. Our primary task, for those of us like myself who live in the United States and spend most of our time here, is the role of our own government. And, of course, the United States has a very sordid history of intervening abroad, a history and a present of intervening abroad, including in Bolivia right now. We don't know the details of exactly how the U.S. is intervening right now, but we do know that Trump and Pompeo and Marco Rubio have been very vocal in support of the coup. We do know that the United States government continues to fund the right-wing opposition groups. So those of us in the United States do, I think, need to take that as our primary responsibility, is to stop U.S. intervention in Bolivia and allow Bolivians to have these complex debates, and they are complex, among themselves.
Pablo Solon, you have said that you thought Evo Morales could go down as perhaps one of the greatest presidents in Latin America. Explain why you feel that way and why first you split with him when formerly you were his ambassador to the United Nations.
Well, I was very close to Evo Morales, and we were friends. And the reason why I broke with him was because there was this repression to the indigenous march of Tipnis, an indigenous territory and a national park, that happened in 2011. 500 policemen went and beat 1,000 indigenous people. And the government said, oh, we didn't order that. But nobody has been punished. The minister of government at that time went at that time to the UN. So for me, that was terrible, because you can make mistakes, but there are principles. An indigenous government cannot use repression against another indigenous group or anyone. And this happened in 2011. For me, I can have disagreements before and after, but this was really very, very, very key. It's something that you cannot accept. And the left accepted that. Most of the left internationally just said, okay, it happened. Second, Evo Morales began to change when he was in the government. At the beginning, the situation was very different. We were fighting against the right-wing forces that didn't allow the Constitutional Assembly to finish. But then, once we were able to have the new constitution, once Evo Morales won the second election and he got 2/3 in the parliament, he began to control all the other institutions, the Supreme Court, the Electoral Court, the Constitutional Court, all the institutions, the ombudsman that were appointed by him or by the parliament with his support, that began to criticize him, were changed because he didn't want nobody to criticize him. So for me, this is a huge problem. And of course, he did very good things. He renegotiated the contracts with the oil companies that allow more money for the state, and you had better programs in terms of health, education, and other sectors. And that's why he has support from popular sectors. But he, at the same time, began to do alliances with right-wing forces, the same right-wing forces that now are against him. For example, all the laws that benefit the big agribusiness in Santa Cruz were approved by the government and by the opposition. That is why when we had these forest fires in Bolivia this year of 5 million hectares, and we began to see what laws allowed this situation, it was clear that the laws had been approved by both the government and the opposition. He tried to give them some concessions in order to have their support. And that was what he did for the past, I would say, 80 years. And that's where we are now. And of course, we always said, come on, those sectors someday are going to just say to you, okay, thank you, but now we want to go back into the government. We expected Evo Morales to change really the economic structures of Bolivia, not to be dependent only on gas export, not to have a big agribusiness that it exists because we as a state give them subsidies. We wanted a real respect to indigenous rights, to the environment. But that was not the case. We went back to GMOs, we went back to biofuels. Evo Morales had plans of building big mega dams. So you had these problems. And that is why Evo Morales began to be very much criticized. And you had also cases of corruption that didn't involve him directly, but involved very high-level persons in the government, and also in indigenous and social organizations.
Kevin Young, as we wrap up this discussion, we'll also have this debate in Spanish. If you could respond to what former Ambassador Pablo Solon has laid out.
Again, I actually agree with most of what Pablo has just said. The government of Evo has by no means an unblemished record. On the one hand, there were enormous gains in poverty reduction. Poverty was reduced by 42%, extreme poverty reduced by 60%, and that was made possible mostly by the raising of taxes on natural gas companies. So those are major gains that we need to emphasize. On the other hand, the criticisms, most of the criticisms that Pablo has just enumerated, I think are valid. And the repression of the Tipnis Indigenous March in September of 2011 is one example. That was, I agree that government repression was completely inexcusable. And, I think we need to be able to hold nuance and complexity here. We need to recognize that the government of Evo Morales was mixed in terms of its record. But those complexities shouldn't make us lose sight of the fundamental truth. And the fundamental truth of what happened on Sunday was that it was still a coup. The situation is not simple. It is complex, but it's still a coup.
And finally, Pablo Solon, do you think what happened has anything to do with what this person tweeted? Shortly before the coup against Bolivia's Evo Morales, the government announced plans to nationalize the highly profitable lithium industry. Your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I think whoever wrote that, I have seen it, is absolutely, totally wrong. I follow personally the issue of lithium. It is totally the opposite. Evo Morales did a very bad contract with a German company that's a very small company of 20 employees. We criticized that. It was a contract for 70 years that wasn't going to pay royalties for the lithium hydroxide that was going to be exported. And the city of Potosi mobilized for several months, asking the government to stop that contract. The government, at the end, almost, I don't remember the exact day, but before they resigned, in an attempt to calm down the mobilizations in Potosi, said, okay, we will annul this supreme decree that has approved this contract with this German company. And point. They were not having a plan to nationalize, because it is already nationalized. What they did was a very bad contract. It's one of the examples of the things that Evo Morales began to do that were wrong.
And finally, Kevin Young, what you think needs to happen right now, and do you think Evo Morales can return from Mexico to Bolivia?
Well, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. But from my vantage point here in the United States, I would reiterate a point that I made earlier, that those of us in the United States need to be primarily focused on stopping our government from intervening. We need to be pressuring our government, including Congress and political candidates, to be condemning the coup that has taken place in Bolivia, so that Bolivians can hash out their own debates.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Kevin Young, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, author of Blood of the Earth, Resource, Nationalism, Revolution, and Empire in Bolivia. And thanks so much to Pablo Solon, former Bolivian ambassador to the United Nations and chief negotiator around climate change, speaking to us from La Paz, Bolivia. To see part one of our discussion, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.